sponsor yield?
Will you yield, Ms. Paulin?
Absolutely.
Ms. Paulin yields.
Thank you, Amy. I just want to go over some notes that I have about this bill, and maybe you can enlighten me on a few of these points. The bill talks about guns left unattended, and I don't mean to, be wise. I'm just trying to ask, what does left unattended mean? For example, would a gun sitting on a nightstand be left unattended if the person was in the bed sleeping?
As a matter of fact, this bill is modeled after a Westchester law that was passed in 1993. It's exactly follows the same format and the same language was used. And that very question came up during the course of that debate. There was a police officer on the county board at the time, and he had a license, a handgun license, and he worried that he slept with the gun under his bed and wanted to be able to continue to do so. So the language that we crafted was modeled after allowing him to do so. So it's purposely worded. So it says immediate possession or control. So he argued that it was in his immediate possession and control because he could reach underneath the bed or, contrary to that, in the nightstand, so that it was in his immediate possession or control so that he could have it if he was worried about a burglar or whatever. So yes, I believe that this wording would allow for that.
So you said it was argued. He argued that. Was it argued in court? Was it argued before the legislature? Because there's a vast difference between making your point before a legislature about to vote on a bill and going to court to defend yourself.
This bill has never been litigated, to my knowledge, in Westchester, so it's never been in court. However, it was debated on the floor of the Westchester County Legislature, and that language was highlighted, and those issues came up in the debate, and it's part of their legislative history.
Okay, but safe to say the bill, as you said, has not ever gone to court to be defended on either side, so we're not exactly sure how a court would rule in the case of something like, a charge under this law happening, right? Nothing's happened yet.
Absolutely. I do know, though in court, they do look at legislative history, and they look at the speeches made, and that can be part of the legislative record, and in fact, it would be part of our record right here.
And what about somebody that might have their firearm in a glove compartment? Same answer, same thing, you think?
In a glove compartment in a car?
Yeah, in a car.
I think, though, the laws are very specific about carrying your gun. If you have a carry license, you can move it around with you. If you don't, they're, they're different. So yep. I think if you have a carry license, then this doesn't even really come up because you would be going on those specific laws. Okay.
So on line 9, it talks about being guilty of failure to safely store. Kind of that's the quote, but there's a little more to it there. When he or she owns it and leaves the firearm out of their immediate possession. So we kind of answered that without having first locked the firearm. One part of the bill talks about it being a Class A misdemeanor, right? I think it was the first part, kind of first section of the bill.
It's actually the second section of the bill. The first section, it's a violation for not safely storing. It's the second section, which is the current law. In addition, for having not safely stored and being convicted of a violation. So those are the two that would.
Okay, and then there's a Class E felony in there in another section.
The Class E felony kicks in if somebody has not safely stored and that weapon or that gun caused physical injury to a third party.
Okay. So if there was no physical injury, then there would be no violation, or would there still be a violation?
There would be a violation if they didn't safely store, period. And obviously they would need to be caught having not safely stored. So that's a violation, which is the same as a traffic infraction.
And the bill does talk about a requirement that before a gun is sold or transferred, that a gun locking device has to be basically included with the sale, correct?
Yes, it does.
And the seller of the gun must provide this notice in what, 24-point font or something? Is that a requirement as well? Or it looks to me like they've got to provide the printed warning.
They should, yes, which is easily duplicated on a computer at home.
So I'm wondering how any of this is enforceable. In other words, who's going to enforce this, whether someone has their firearms locked up or not? And I'm not saying it's not a good idea. I am saying that the government should not mandate it, but that should be the law-abiding citizen's choice to do so. But who's going to enforce this on a day-to-day basis? Is it basically one of these instances where when there's an incident, we're then going to find out that the guns were not safely locked?
I believe that would be most times, yes, unless there was another occasion to go into someone's home for another infraction that they were doing. So yes, I think just like seatbelt laws, you don't necessarily, it's only on inspection, or if there was a traffic accident, would you know that somebody wasn't wearing their seatbelt, which is also, the same kind of crime.
And you don't have any expectation, I would think, that criminals are going to at all obey this law with their guns.
The point is, the point is not to necessarily ask criminals to do, if we could prevent criminals from doing a lot of things, we would, or to encourage them to do other things, we would. So this isn't really about criminals. It's about safely storing a gun in your home so that it's not used for, that a child doesn't find it and use it against another child, which we know has happened and happens very often and many times in this very state. And it's also to prevent often their use for teenage suicides. So that's really the motivation of the bill.
Now, what about the fact that millions of Americans, maybe millions of New Yorkers, it might even be that high, own a firearm for the protection of their home and family? What right does this government have to say to a single mother, for example, out in the rural part of New York, where, by the way, we may have two homicidal maniacs running free? What right does the government have to say that you must lock your firearm up and thereby disadvantage you from protecting your family and children?
Well, as I said, that this law does not prevent someone from having a gun. This law does not prevent someone from having a gun nearby as long as it's in their control. And that might have been a good question before June 8th. On June 8th, the Supreme Court denied hearing a case that was exactly on this point, on safe storage. There was a San Francisco case, and they had a safe storage bill, and it went to the Court of Appeals, and they essentially said that that is an appropriate law. It does not violate the Second Amendment, and the Supreme Court denied hearing it, and they denied hearing it, obviously, which reinforces our position that safe storage is an appropriate way to confine guns, and it doesn't violate the Second Amendment, which the Supreme Court has also said is appropriate for for someone's protection of their own self or their own family.
What about what constitutes safe storage? If I have a gun safe that has a lock and a glass door, which many of them do, is that considered safe storage if I don't have a trigger lock on those guns inside that glass case?
Yes.
Even though the glass is not unbreakable?
Yes, that would be considered safe storage. Again, when we did this bill in Westchester, that came up. In fact, we had the gun owners there, and initially it was a trigger lock law that we were proposing, or not we, but many of the county board members were proposing, and The gun owners themselves said, wait, there are antique weapons, there aren't trigger locks that are that you can buy. This is not, we can safely store our guns differently. And so what they did in Westchester is change the language, which we copied right here, to allow for safe storage in many ways. So yes, if there was a case that was a glass enclosed case that was not breakable, that had a lock, that would count as safe storage.
And if I think I read this correct. Let's say somebody lives alone. They don't fall under these requirements, would they, if there's nobody else residing in their home?
Yes, because this law, and again, it's only upon inspection. So if they never had a visitor and no one ever came in, they would never know. However, we, most of us, occasionally might have a child in the home, might have an older person in the home, might have someone who was curious in the home, someone who had a mental impairment, who was convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence crime, where there was maybe that person had an order of protection against them even though they lived alone. So under the current law, they would be in violation now.
Right.
And this would just go a little further, assuming that they would then have additional visitors, because most people do.
So what you just said, I agree with. Under current law, they would already be in violation. You mean current law meaning the SAFE Act?
Yes.
Yes. So this builds on more restrictions on top of the SAFE Act.
Yes, it does.
Okay. And again, I'm not, just for the record, not saying that storing your guns properly is not responsible. That is a responsible thing to do. I just have a problem with mandating it for the citizens of New York, who have overwhelmingly proven that they know what they're doing handling their own firearms. Amy,
And just one point
yeah,
on
go ahead.
that.
Yeah.
Half the state already does require this. This is a requirement in New York City, in Westchester, in Buffalo, Rochester, and I think Albany, soon Albany. So there's already a requirement for, if not half, almost nearly half of the population in the state.
And what would you say to someone that said, Amy, this could actually impact somebody in a negative way and cause an increase in violent crime, an increase in home invasions? Because there are many, many instances where intruders are scared away because of the presence of a firearm. We've seen, I do have some statistics here about that I'll talk about when I speak on the bill. But there are many instances where an intruder is scared away and a violent crime or murder or other violent crimes are prevented from taking place. And what would you say to somebody that says, hey, you're preventing my ability to possibly prevent that from happening by making me safely store what I otherwise have a perfectly great track record on handling?
Well, I would argue that, we are not preventing someone, again, from having that gun nearby so that they can use it. I would argue that the only person who might know that you had a gun in your house would be someone who wanted to steal it, perhaps, and safely storing it would prevent that theft. So it would be, and that gun might be used to harm someone. So I would argue that I don't really see an argument for increasing violent crime. I actually see an argument for decreasing it, because we would prevent a lot of the thefts. There was a study in Monroe County, for example, and Monroe County did their own study on the crime guns that were used, and nearly, I think it was 75% of the crime guns in Monroe County were purchased or stolen from New York State, not outside the state, not anywhere else, and that's true for a lot of upstate communities. So, I would think that, preventing theft is so much more important, because we would be preventing so many of the crimes, particularly in upstate New York.
Well, I would counter that preventing a armed robbery, an assault, a rape, a murder is much more important to the person that owns the firearm at that time than is the prevention of the theft of their gun. Also, I get your point about what you're saying as far as the theft of the gun, but that's not what I'm getting at. What happens overwhelmingly is that the prevention of these violent crimes, it stops. That prevention takes place because of the presence of the gun. In fact, there was a Yale Law School paper that talked about during the first 5 years after passage of safe storage laws, a group of 15 states that adopted those laws faced an average increase, 300 murders, 3,860 more rapes, 24,500 more robberies, and 25,000 more aggravated assaults. Amy, thank you. I'll be back to speak on the bill. Thank you.